What happens when the pursuit of perfection becomes a prison? In the history of modern music, there is perhaps no story as frustrating and heartbreaking as the tale of the Blue Nile. To their devoted fans, they are not just a band, they are a religion. They are the group that superstars like Madonna, Annie Lennox, and Prince hailed as geniuses. They created a sound so pristine and emotional that it seemed to exist outside of time, capturing the exact feeling of walking through a rainy city street at 2 in the morning. Yet, despite the adoration of the industry giants and a debut album that many consider a flaw-free masterpiece, they spent decades in the shadows, releasing a pitifully small amount of music before fading into a heavy silence. This is not a typical story of drug addiction or public scandals. There were no hotel rooms trashed or tabloid headlines screaming about arrests. Instead, the tragedy of the Blue Nile is much more human and painful. It is a story about 3 friends who loved music so much that they became paralyzed by the fear of making a mistake. It is about a vault of lost songs that were scrapped because they were merely great instead of perfect, and the slow, agonizing disintegration of a brotherhood under the weight of unspoken grievances. With their name recently resurfacing thanks to a lyric from Taylor Swift, millions are discovering them for the first time. But to truly understand their music, you have to understand the pain and the silence that surrounded it. How did a group with the world at their feet manage to sabotage their own destiny?
To understand why the Blue Nile was destined for such a complicated existence, you first have to understand where they came from. This was not a band formed in the glossy studios of London or Los Angeles. They were born in the gritty, industrial grey of Glasgow, Scotland in the late 1970s. Paul Buchanan, Robert Bell, and Paul Joseph Moore were university friends who drifted together not out of a burning desire for fame, but out of a shared sense of isolation. They were awkward, intellectual, and seemingly out of place in the punk-dominated music scene of the time. In fact, their breakthrough did not come from a record label executive discovering them in a smoky club. It came from a local company that made high-end audio equipment. A company called Lynn Products was looking for music that was recorded cleanly enough to demonstrate the power of their expensive speakers and turntables. They were not looking for hits, they were looking for sonic perfection. They approached the band and offered to pay for a recording session simply because they needed a track to test a new cutting lathe. This is the crucial detail that defined their entire career. The Blue Nile started as a test subject for high-fidelity sound. Because they were recording for audiophiles, they became obsessed with the texture of every single note. They did not have a drummer, so they relied on electronic drum machines, but they treated the technology with a human touch, creating a spacious, atmospheric sound that felt unlike anything else on the radio in 1984. The result of this experiment was their debut album, A Walk Across the Rooftops. When it was released, the music press was stunned. It was a collection of 7 songs that felt incredibly intimate, as if Paul Buchanan was whispering secrets directly into your ear. The single Tinseltown in the Rain became an anthem, capturing the romance and misery of city life perfectly. Suddenly, these 3 shy introverts from Glasgow were being hailed as the saviors of modern pop music. They had achieved the impossible. They had created a masterpiece by accident, without even trying to fit into the music industry's mold. But success is a dangerous thing for perfectionists. The world was now watching them, waiting for their next move, and the pressure to repeat that accidental magic would soon paralyze them completely. They had proven they could walk across the rooftops, but they had no idea how to get back down.
In the music industry, momentum is everything.
When a band scores a hit record, the standard procedure is to rush back into the studio, tour the world, and release a follow-up album within 18 months to keep the public interested. But the Blue Nile did not operate by standard procedures. After the surprise success of their debut in 1984, they did not accelerate, they hit the brakes. The band retreated into a self-imposed exile that would last for 5 long years. To the outside world, it looked like arrogance or laziness. How could a new band simply vanish for half a decade? But behind closed doors, the reality was far more distressing. The 3 members were living together in a small flat in Glasgow, existing in what lead singer Paul Buchanan later described as a permanent state of emergency. They were paralyzed by the weight of their own expectations. They had convinced themselves that every single sound, every synthesizer preset, and every syllable of a lyric had to be absolutely perfect, or it was not worth releasing. They would spend weeks working on a single snare drum sound, only to scrap it and start over. The record label, Virgin Records, was growing increasingly furious. They had a band that critics adored, but no product to sell. At one point, the pressure became so intense that the band very nearly erased the master tapes of their second album entirely. They felt the music was simply not good enough. It was a level of artistic insecurity that bordered on madness. They were creating beautiful, serene music, but the process of making it was a psychological nightmare. When the second album, titled Hats, finally emerged in 1989, it was immediately recognized as a masterpiece of late-night melancholia. It was smoother, sadder, and even more electronic than their debut. Songs like The Downtown Lights and Headlights on the Parade sounded like they had been crafted by artisans who had spent a lifetime polishing a diamond. And in a way, they had. But the cost of that polish was 5 years of their youth and a reputation for being difficult and unreliable. The tragedy was already taking shape. They were a band that could only produce magic by destroying themselves in the process. And while Hats brought them critical worship, the long delay meant they had missed the wave of their initial momentum. They had created a classic, but they had also proven that they were incapable of playing the music industry's game. And things were only going to get more complicated as they looked toward America. With the release of Hats, the secret was truly out. The Blue Nile was no longer just a local curiosity. They were the favorite band of the world's biggest superstars. Musicians ranging from Peter Gabriel to Rod Stewart were publicly singing their praises. This sudden wave of adoration opened doors that had previously been locked tight, and for a brief moment, it looked like the band was going to conquer America. They were courted by major labels and invited to Los Angeles, trading the gray skies of Scotland for the blinding sunshine of California. It seemed like the natural next step. They were collaborating with high-profile artists, with Paul Buchanan writing songs for the likes of Julian Lennon and Annie Lennox. The industry machinery was ready to turn them into household names, positioning Buchanan as the next great soulful crooner, a sophisticated alternative to the pop stars of the early 1990s. However, the transition to the American way of doing things was a disaster for a group that operated on intuition and silence. The American music business is built on speed, networking, and compromise, 3 things the Blue Nile were fundamentally incapable of. Executives wanted them to produce radio-friendly hits and tour relentlessly, but the band refused to play the game. They were uncomfortable with the idea of celebrity. There are stories of the band turning down massive opportunities simply because they did not feel right or because they were too busy agonizing over the texture of a synthesizer sound. They were offered the world, but they treated it with suspicion. Instead of riding the wave of their popularity, they found themselves bogged down in legal battles and label politics. Their American record label, Warner Brothers, struggled to understand how to market a band that refused to act like rock stars. This period, which should have been their golden age, instead became a time of frustration and missed connections. While they were rubbing shoulders with the elite of Hollywood, their own output ground to a complete halt. They spent years working on projects that either stalled or lacked the magic of their previous work. The sunny optimism of California seemed to dry up their creative well rather than replenish it. They were fish out of water, and the pressure to deliver a commercial smash hit only made them retreat further into their shells. They had gone to America to become giants, but they ended up losing themselves in the machinery. When they finally returned home, they were no closer to a third album than they had been years before. The American dream had not liberated them. It had only deepened the silence, setting the stage for another agonizingly long gap that would test the loyalty of even their most devoted fans.
If the 5-year gap between their first 2 albums felt like a lifetime to fans, what followed next was an eternity. After the promotional cycle for hats wound down in the early 1990s, the Blue Nile essentially vanished from the face of the earth. For 7 long years, there was silence. To put that into perspective, in the time it took for the Blue Nile to follow up their second album, the entire grunge movement exploded and died with Nirvana, and the Britpop era of Oasis and Blur rose to dominance. The musical landscape changed completely, shifting from polished synthesizers to raw guitars, but the Blue Nile remained frozen in time, nowhere to be found. Rumors began to circulate wildly. Some fans whispered that the band had secretly broken up. Others speculated that Paul Buchanan had suffered a nervous breakdown or that he had lost his voice entirely. The truth was less dramatic, but perhaps more painful. They were simply stuck. They were caught in a cycle of perfectionism and self-doubt that had become debilitating. During these wilderness years, a strange paradox emerged regarding the band's status. They were arguably the most critically acclaimed band on the planet, cited as influences by the biggest rock stars in the world. Yet, despite the endorsements from legends like Bono and Madonna, the members of the Blue Nile were not living in mansions with swimming pools. They were facing genuine financial struggles. They were a musicians band, which meant they had immense respect, but not the massive record sales required to sustain a lavish lifestyle over a 7-year hiatus. They were living like starving artists, while the press hailed them as geniuses. Paul Buchanan, in particular, seemed to drift further into the shadows during this time. He became a figure of urban mythology in Glasgow, a man often seen walking alone at night, looking just as melancholy as the characters in his songs. The band had no manager to push them, and no record label brave enough to demand a finished product. They were operating without a map, drifting aimlessly while the world moved on without them. The pressure to produce something that lived up to the legacy of hats was so immense that it effectively silenced them. They would record demos, listen to them, and then discard them, convinced they were not good enough. It was a period of lost time and lost opportunities, a 7-year void where the band existed in name only. When they finally did re-emerge from this hibernation, the world they returned to was very different, and the music they brought with them would shock everyone who had spent nearly a decade waiting for the return of the electronic masters. When the silence finally broke in 1996, the result was not a celebration, but a shockwave of confusion. After 7 years of waiting, fans rushed to record stores to buy the new album, titled Peace at Last. They were expecting a continuation of the lush, cinematic, electronic landscapes that had defined the band's previous masterpiece, Hats. They wanted more of the synthesizer magic that made them feel like they were driving through a neon-lit city at midnight. Instead, when they pressed play, they were greeted by the dry, scratchy sound of an acoustic guitar. It was a radical departure that caught almost everyone off guard. The pristine, high-fidelity production that had made them famous, the very sound that had launched them as the darlings of the audio equipment world, was gone. In its place was something raw, ragged, and uncomfortably personal. The backlash was immediate and sharp. While some critics appreciated the vulnerability of the new songs, many die-hard fans felt a deep sense of betrayal. They accused the band of losing their identity. The lush electronic textures were replaced by gospel choirs and simple strumming, leading some to claim that it sounded more like a Paul Buchanan solo demo than a proper Blue Nile album. This drastic shift in style was not just an artistic choice, it was a symptom of the band's internal struggles. During the long hiatus, Buchanan had struggled to write on the keyboard, eventually turning to the guitar just to get ideas flowing. but by shifting the focus to a traditional singer-songwriter instrument, he inadvertently marginalized the other two members. Robert Bell and Paul Joseph Moore were masters of texture and atmosphere, but there is only so much a synthesizer wizard can do on a folk rock album. This era marked the beginning of the visible fractures within the trio. For the first time, the band did not sound like a cohesive unit operating in telepathic harmony. It sounded like a singer trying to find his way while his bandmates tried to fit into the background. The album performed respectably on the charts, but the magic of their unique chemistry seemed to be fading. The Blue Nile sound, that specific, unidentifiable mixture of man and machine, was traded for something far more ordinary. The controversy surrounding Peace at Last was not just about musical taste. It was the sound of a band having an identity crisis. They had finally released new music, but in doing so, they had exposed the fact that they were no longer the same three people who had walked across the rooftops 12 years earlier. The foundation was cracking, and one member in particular was about to drift away into the void.
For over 2 decades, the Blue Nile operated as a perfect triangle. The dynamic was delicate and essential. Paul Buchanan provided the heart and the voice. Robert Bell provided the grounding and technical structure. And Paul Joseph Moore provided the atmosphere. Moore was the keyboard wizard, the man responsible for the shimmering, intangible textures that made their records sound like paintings rather than just pop songs. But as the band drifted into the new millennium, that triangle began to lose its shape. The tragedy of this period wasn't a loud argument or a lawsuit. It was the slow, painful realization that one of the members was simply fading out of the picture. Paul Joseph Moore, the man who had helped define their sonic identity, was becoming an invisible member. The shift towards acoustic songwriting on Peace at Last had left Moore with less to do. The band had always functioned as a democracy, where every note was debated by all three members, but the creative balance had tipped heavily in Buchanan's favor. The friendship that had bound them together since university was eroding under the weight of silence and unsaid frustrations. There was no official press release announcing his departure, and there was no farewell concert. Instead, Moore simply stopped being part of the process. When the band eventually regrouped to work on their 4th album, he was notably absent from the sessions. It was a ghosting that happened in slow motion. The bandmates who had once lived in each other's pockets now seemed to be living in different worlds entirely. This quiet exit is perhaps the saddest part of the Blue Nile story. In most bands, a member leaving is treated as a business transaction. They are replaced and the show goes on. But for the Blue Nile, Moore's absence was a fatal blow to their chemistry. Without his input, the delicate tension that made their music so special was gone. Buchanan and Bell continued on, but the Gang of Three mentality was broken. Fans began to realize that the band they loved was effectively dissolving before their eyes, not with a bang, but with a whimper. The silence that they had used so effectively in their music now had infected their personal relationships. They stopped calling each other, they stopped checking in, and as they prepared for what would become their final act, it was clear that the brotherhood was already dead, leaving only the brand name behind. The release of their 4th and final album, titled High, in the year 2004, should have been a triumphant return. But instead, it felt more like a long, exhausted goodbye letter. By this point, another 8 years had passed since their previous record, and the landscape of the band had changed irrevocably. Paul Joseph Moore was officially gone, leaving Paul Buchanan and Robert Bell to steer the ship alone. While the album had moments of beauty, critics and fans alike noticed that the spark was dimming. The tension and the electric atmosphere that defined their early work had been replaced by a sense of resignation. It was the sound of a band that was no longer looking forward to the future, but rather looking back at what they had lost. They toured to support the record, playing emotional shows to adoring crowds, but the energy backstage was different. The shared dream that had carried them from Glasgow to Los Angeles was running on fumes. What happened next is the most baffling part of the entire saga. In the history of rock music, bands usually end with a bang. There is usually a press conference, a final farewell tour, or a public statement thanking the fans for decades of support. The Blue Nile did none of these things. After the promotional duties for High were finished, they simply went home and closed the door. There was no announcement of a breakup. There was no fight reported in the newspapers. They just stopped. It was a phenomenon that we might call quiet quitting today, but back then it was agonizingly confused. They simply drifted apart. Paul Buchanan later admitted in interviews that the phone just stopped ringing. They did not make a conscious decision to end the band. They just collectively lost the will to keep fighting for it. This lack of closure is the final tragedy of the Blue Nile. They left their legacy suspended in midair, an unfinished sentence that has hung over their fans for 20 years. The three friends who had once been inseparable, who had created a world of their own because they didn't fit into the real one, had allowed the silence to win. The perfectionism that had driven them to create masterpieces had eventually paralyzed them to the point of total inaction. They didn't hate each other. They just couldn't bear the weight of being the Blue Nile anymore. It was a quiet, heartbreaking end to a career that deserved a standing ovation. They faded into the gray Glasgow mist from which they came, leaving the world to wonder if they would ever speak to each other again.
For nearly a decade following their quiet dissolution, the Blue Nile existed as a ghost story in the music industry. Paul Buchanan briefly emerged from his seclusion in the year 2012 to release a solo album titled Midair, a collection of songs so sparse and fragile that they barely rose above a whisper. It was a beautiful record, but it confirmed that the grand, cinematic sound of the full band was gone forever. The members lived quiet lives, far removed from the spotlight, while their records gathered dust in the collections of audio purists. They were the ultimate if you know band, a secret handshake shared by serious music lovers and fellow musicians. Acts like the 1975 frequently cited them as a massive influence, with lead singer Matty Healy often describing them as his favorite band of all time. But for the general public, the Blue Nile remained a mystery, a name from the past that had faded into obscurity. Then, in April of 2024, something extraordinary happened. The biggest pop star on the planet, Taylor Swift, released her album The Tortured Poets Department. On the track titled Guilty as Sin, she sings a line about her fatal fantasies giving way to labored breath, while explicitly referencing drowning in the Blue Nile. Overnight, the band trended globally on search engines. Millions of young fans who had never heard of Three Sad Scotsmen from the 1980s were suddenly streaming Hats and A Walk Across the Rooftops. The streaming numbers for their song The Downtown Lights skyrocketed by huge percentages. It was a surreal cultural collision. A band that had spent their entire career avoiding fame and hiding from the commercial machine was suddenly thrust into the center of the biggest pop culture conversation of the year. This resurgence is bittersweet. On one hand, it is the vindication that their fans have waited 40 years for. It proves that the music they made was timeless, capable of connecting with a generation born decades after the songs were recorded. The meticulous perfectionism that caused them so much pain has ultimately preserved their work. Because they never chased trends, their music never aged. However, the tragedy remains that this victory lap is being run alone. The band is not there to enjoy it together. There is no reunion tour to capitalize on the Taylor Swift effect. There are no new interviews with the trio sitting on a couch laughing about the old days. The world is finally caught up to the Blue Nile. But the Blue Nile is no longer there to greet it. They have become exactly what their music always sounded like, a beautiful, distant memory that you can feel but never quite touch.
When we look back at the tragic timeline of the Blue Nile, it is easy to feel a sense of frustration. In a career spanning over 30 years, they produced just 4 albums. That is a total of fewer than 40 songs. We are left to wonder what could have been. How many masterpieces were lost in the state of emergency that paralyzed them? How many beautiful melodies were erased from the tapes because the snare drum didn't sound exactly right? It is tempting to view their story as a failure of potential, a cautionary tale about how perfectionism can destroy art. We mourn the lost years, the broken friendships, and the silence that swallowed one of the greatest bands of their generation. But perhaps that is looking at it the wrong way. In a world where content is churned out every single day, where artists are pressured to release constant streams of forgettable videos and singles just to stay relevant, the Blue Nile stands as a monument to the opposite philosophy. They sacrificed everything, their fame, their fortune, and even their brotherhood, to ensure that every single note they released was true. They refused to compromise. The tragedy is real, but so is the triumph. They captured the feeling of a city at night better than anyone else in history, and they left behind a small, flawless body of work that will continue to break hearts for another 100 years. They may have walked away into the rain, but the lights they turned on are still burning. And maybe, just maybe, that is enough. So, I have to ask you, do you think the music was worth the silence, or did they throw away their careers for nothing? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. If you enjoyed uncovering this hidden story, please hit the like button and make sure you subscribe to Retro Celeb Talk. We are digging deep into the archives to bring you the most fascinating untold stories from music and Hollywood history, and you do not want to miss what is coming next. Thanks for watching.